By the time Ruby Brooks reached the second page, the ink had already marked her as compliant, and she could feel the contract settling over her shoulders like a borrowed cloak cut for someone smaller, tighter at the throat than at the waist. Lenora Pike sat opposite her behind a walnut desk polished to a mirror shine, one gloved finger resting on the line that required Ruby to stand on the marble dais from 8 until midnight as the Foundation's featured beneficiary, smiling for patrons who would never remember her surname. The office smelled of sealing wax and lavender starch, with a bitter undertone from the coal grate that never fully warmed the room. Ruby read every clause anyway. She had learned in this building that harm was often hidden in subordinate phrases. "You are delaying," Lenora said, not unkindly and not kind. "The musicians are already in rehearsal." Ruby lifted her eyes. Lenora's were pale and dry, the colour of winter glass, and they carried the habitual boredom of a woman accustomed to being obeyed before she raised her voice. On the desk beside the blotter and brass letter opener lay 3 objects placed with clerical precision: Ruby's room key, the tuition disbursement ledger for St. Brigid's College, and the chemist's account book with her brother's name written in a narrow hand across the top margin. Lenora did not touch them. She did not need to. "The language says I may be reassigned to donor table service at committee discretion," Ruby said. "That was not in the previous draft." "The language says what it must." Lenora adjusted a stack of invitation cards without looking down. "You are receiving support under exceptional terms. Flexibility is expected." Ruby held the pen still over the final line. She thought of Theo's cough in early mornings, when the damp crept under the dormitory windows. She thought of the blue bottle in the chemist's shop that cost more than a week of her tutoring wages. She thought, with an irritation that surprised her, of the phrase "exceptional terms" and how often it had been used to dress obedience in gratitude. Her hand did not tremble until she wrote her name. Then it trembled once, quickly, and stopped. Lenora slid the contract aside before the ink had dried. "Well done. There is no need for theatrics." Ruby folded her hands in her lap. "I did not perform anything, Mrs. Pike." A faint pause. Then Lenora gave a small nod, as if Ruby had confirmed some private arithmetic. "You will stand where you are placed. You will answer simple questions from press and patrons. You will not discuss policy, donor access, governance, or your family. You will say the Foundation gave you a future. You will say it made education possible." "Understood." "You will wear the cream gown in wardrobe 3. Ruby looked down at her own dress, dove grey and plain, cuffs mended from the inside so the stitches did not show. "The cream gown is 2 sizes too large. Pins exist for that purpose." Lenora's voice remained almost gentle. "Do try to remember, Miss Brooks, that this evening is not about your comfort. It is about confidence. Donors must feel their money is wisely placed." Ruby did not ask whether confidence meant seeing a scholarship student displayed beneath chandelier light, like a specimen of successful charity. She had asked a version of that question in her first year, and Lenora had answered with a sentence she never needed to repeat. "Unpolished girls," Mrs. Pike had said, "mistake visibility for power." Outside the office, the corridor ran long and cold between portrait niches, and side doors marked staff access. Ruby took the back stair because she was not permitted the front staircase during event hours. A footman had corrected her once, with apologetic embarrassment, and she had thanked him as though he had done her a favour. On the landing, she paused to flex her ink-stained fingers. Her palm still carried the pressure of the pen. She could not decide which stung more, the signature itself or the brief flare of relief that had followed it when she saw Theo's account book remain on Lenora's desk. unopened but untouched. By the first week of September, Ruby had learned the estate in the pattern of those who move through it without being seen. Morning began in the records room below the East Wing, where she catalogued donor correspondence under the supervision of a clerk who never looked directly at her and called her Miss Brooks only when visitors were present. The room had one high window and no carpet. Paper dust settled into her cuffs, and the clock above the filing cabinet ran 6 minutes slow. At noon, she crossed to the school annex to tutor arithmetic and composition for children, whose mothers sent notes addressed to the foundation girl, and thanked the staff for their daughter's improvement. In the evenings, she returned to her narrow room above the laundry, where steam thickened the walls, and candles guttered if she set them too near the draught. There she stitched, unpicked, and stitched again, turning old ribbon and salvage lace into gloves that could pass under ballroom light as proper. She kept a list in the back of her grammar book. Tuition date, chemist date, rent date, Theo's next doctor's review. Numbers steadied her. Numbers obeyed rules. People attached conditions. 2 hours before the gala's opening procession, Wardrobe 3 smelled of camphor, pressed silk, and the metallic scent of new pins. A maid she did not know held the cream gown at shoulder height, while Ruby stepped in, careful not to tear the seam at the side panel where previous wear had strained the stitch line. The bodice gaped at the collarbone, then crushed at the ribs once pinned. Ruby stood with her arms raised while the maid worked quickly, making no conversation beyond practical warnings. Lift, please, turn, hold still. The mirror showed a woman she recognized only in fragments. Her own dark hair swept into a style designed to soften her jaw, her own eyes made brighter by powder she had not chosen, her own mouth set in a line that could be mistaken for calm if no one watched her long enough. When she reached for the scholarship pin at her dressing table, Lenora was already in the doorway. "Not there," Lenora said. "On the left shoulder, visible in photographs." Ruby moved it. Higher. She moved it again. Lenora crossed the room, adjusted the pin by 1/2 inch, and stepped back. "Better. You are not to remove it." "I had not intended to." "I prefer certainty to intention." Ruby met her gaze in the mirror. "As you wish." Lenora's reflection did not alter, but her voice cooled by a degree. "A practical reminder, Miss Brooks. The college bursar has asked whether your Michaelmas installment will be regular this term. I assured him it would be, provided tonight proceeds without avoidable complications." Ruby felt heat rise under the powder on her cheeks. "Theo's account?" "Current." Lenora glanced at her wristwatch. "Again, provided tonight proceeds without avoidable complications." The words landed without force and did more damage for it. Lenora never shouted. She arranged outcomes. She made coercion sound like housekeeping, as if she were merely balancing lamps and linens and not calibrating another person's life against donor comfort. Ruby pressed her thumbnail into her palm until the pain sharpened her breathing. "I will be where you place me," she said. "Yes." Lenora's mouth curved in something not quite approval. "That has always been your most useful quality." The ballroom doors stood open by dusk, revealing marble floors that reflected the chandeliers in fractured light, gilt moulding that caught every candle flame, and a dais set at the far end beneath the foundation crest. 2 men were still adjusting the velvet rope stanchions around it. A string quartet rehearsed in the alcove, not yet in full tempo, bow strokes clipping at the edges as if the room itself required tuning. Ruby was guided to her mark by a steward carrying a clipboard and instructed to remain in place while photographers tested flash powder angles. She stood where indicated, hands loosely folded, chin lifted precisely as trained by last year's media consultant, and tried not to inhale when the first burst of light stung her eyes. Below the dais, Committee women in jewel-colored silk reviewed seating cards and flower placements with brisk displeasure. One of them looked up, assessed Ruby's pinned shoulder, and gave a satisfied nod as if a centerpiece had arrived intact. "Do not slouch," Lenora called from the floor. Ruby straightened by habit. Her ribs protested against the pinned bodice. A footman passed within arm's reach carrying a tray of crystal glasses. He did not look at her. Another adjusted the candelabra near the donor archway, then stepped back, head tilted, calculating symmetry. Voices rose in polished fragments around her. Endowment percentages, press list revisions, Baroness Merton's dietary restrictions, whether gratitude photographs should be taken before supper or after the auction speech. Ruby remained still and understood, with a clarity that felt almost cold, that stillness was not the same as surrender. One could be displayed and not diminished. One could stand where ordered and still keep an interior line uncrossed. When Lenora approached the dais for final instructions, she did not lower her voice. "Remember," she said, glancing up, as if addressing the marble behind Ruby rather than the woman herself. "You are here because we chose to elevate you. Speak accordingly." Ruby looked down at her guardian and felt the old pressure in her chest, the familiar constriction between fear and fury. She did not let either reach her face. "I will speak precisely," she said. Lenora gave the smallest of smiles, mistaking precision for obedience, and turned away to greet the first arriving patrons beneath the blaze of the chandeliers. The first patron to address her did not offer his name, only his cuff for display, as if she were expected to admire the embroidery before he inquired after her gratitude. Ruby answered as instructed, voice steady, hands still, and watched him move on to the champagne table before she had finished her second sentence. A woman in peacock silk asked whether scholarship students were taught French now. Another asked whether Ruby had always looked so serious. A third pinched the edge of Ruby's sleeve and said to no one in particular that frugality had become surprisingly fashionable. Lenora remained in motion below the dais, receiving bows, redirecting conversations, touching elbows with proprietary ease. Each time Ruby's expressions settled into neutrality, Lenora glanced up once, a small reminder disguised as event management. The marble beneath Ruby's shoes held no warmth at all. A footman replaced her untouched water glass twice without meeting her eyes. The scholarship pin on her shoulder grew heavier by degrees. A small circle of metal turned into a collar by repetition. She stood through the opening procession, through the mayor's remarks, through the committee's practiced laughter, while the quartet shifted from rehearsal precision to polished sweep. Every 15 minutes a steward checked her posture in the reflection of the nearest pier mirror and nodded as though confirming the position of a display cabinet. She obeyed each correction before it was spoken. She had learned long ago that quick compliance shortened the lecture that followed. When a cluster of younger patrons gathered beneath the dais steps, Ruby recognized two girls from the afternoon arithmetic class by their braids and their mother's gloves. They looked up at her with bright curiosity, then at their mother for instruction. "Is she one of your teachers?" the older child asked. The mother smiled without looking at Ruby. "No, darling, she is the example." Ruby let the words pass across her face like light across stone. She did not look away from the children. "Your fractions were correct today, Miss Ellery," she said gently. "Do not forget to reduce before carrying." The child blinked, startled into recognition, and gave a quick, secret smile before being guided towards supper. Lenora saw the exchange from the donor archway and made a minute cutting motion with two fingers. Less familiarity. Ruby inclined her head. The gesture cost nothing. The silence after it cost more. By the time the first waltz ended, the ballroom had settled into its hierarchy, and Ruby could map the evening's power by sound alone. The clipped certainty near the trustees' table, the rising competition around pledged sums, the brittle amusement where titled men discussed philanthropy as sport. A clerk hurried to the dais with an apologetic bow and asked whether Miss Brooks could assist in the counting room for 10 minutes only, as the pledge cards had been misfiled and the committee secretary was in tears. Lenora consented without consulting Ruby. "Take the service corridor," she said. "Return before the auction announcements." Ruby descended the side steps and crossed the edge of the dance floor where no guest would have thought to look for her. The air changed immediately at the staff door. Beeswax and perfume gave way to starch, coal smoke, and boiled tea. She passed the narrow staircase she used each morning and the storage alcove where broken easels waited for repair. And the familiarity of these back passages struck her with almost physical force. Here was her world in miniature, compressed into brick and brass and practical light. The records room door stood ajar, ledgers stacked by month exactly as she had ordered them. The school annex beyond the courtyard held dark windows now, but she could picture every desk, every ink blot, every childish hand lifted halfway when uncertain of a sum. Upstairs, beyond 2 turns and the laundry vent, her small room waited with its one chair and mended blanket and grammar book full of dates written in a margin no one else opened. In the counting room, she sorted pledge cards by district while 2 junior clerks argued over a missing signature. They addressed each other by surname and addressed her not at all until she separated the false duplicates from the valid stack and set them beneath the proper seal. One clerk stopped speaking mid-sentence, frowned at her arrangement, then copied it without comment. Ruby left before he could decide whether to thank her. In the corridor outside, she paused to press her fingertips against the cool stone and let her breathing even. The evening had not altered anything, she told herself. It had only brightened what was already true. A steward intercepted her near the conservatory passage and asked for the list of late arrivals that Lenora kept in a black leather ledger. Ruby knew exactly where it would be left, because Lenora left important objects in predictable places and moved people like markers around them. The ledger should have been in the receiving office just beyond the service corridor leading to the kitchens. Ruby took the route she knew best, past the dumbwaiter, across the narrow tiled crossway, through the corridor lined with extra candelabra and folded screens. That was where she saw him first. He stood near the crate stack beneath the gas bracket, one hand braced on the wall as if deciding whether to put weight on his left leg. His porter's coat had been brushed hard enough to raise pale streaks at the seams. The cuffs were clean, but threadbare. A copper tray rested on the floor beside him, tilted where he had set it down too quickly. He was perhaps a few years older than Ruby, though the stillness in his face made age difficult to place. His eyes were dark and direct, not the cautious glance of temporary staff uncertain of rank. He looked at the corridor as if he expected it to answer to him. Ruby had already taken 3 steps past before she stopped. The kitchen door stood open behind her. Steam carried the scent of cloves and stock into the hall. She turned back, crossed to the sideboard, and filled a plain tumbler from the jug meant for staff. When she offered it, he straightened in one controlled movement and accepted with his uninjured hand. "Thank you," he said. His voice was low, measured. "You noticed?" It was difficult not to. A brief pause, then the faintest shift at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Most people manage it. He drank half the water and handed the glass back with care, as if the exchange required ceremony despite the corridor and the crate dust and the noise from the ballroom swelling beyond the double doors. Up close she saw that his hands were calloused in the pattern of outdoor labour. but the nails were trimmed with unusual precision. A small burn mark crossed the knuckle of his thumb. His gaze dropped once to the scholarship pin at her shoulder and returned to her face without either pity or curiosity, only assessment. "You should not stand so long in those shoes," he said. Ruby almost laughed at the plainness of it. "I was informed I should." "Then you were informed poorly." She lifted one brow. "A dangerous opinion for a temporary porter." "Only if repeated." From the ballroom end of the passage came the snap of a steward's fingers, summoning someone unseen. The man, Elias, she would learn from the roster card pinned crookedly near the kitchen, set the empty tumbler on the sideboard instead of giving it back to her directly, preserving the line between staff and featured beneficiary that the house demanded at all times. Yet before he bent for the tray, he said, "Miss Brooks." She stilled. "You know my name." "The whole room does." He lifted the copper tray with a careful shift that protected his left leg. Few bother to use it. Then he moved down the corridor with a gait that concealed pain by discipline, and two stewards coming the other direction stepped aside for him without seeming to understand why they had done it. Ruby stood for one breath too long, tumbler cool against her palm, and then resumed her errand. The receiving office door was half closed, light spilling in a narrow blade across the floor. She reached for the handle and heard Lenora's voice before she touched it, flattened to that administrative calm that made cruelty sound efficient. "No, Mr. Holden, we cannot risk sentiment tonight," Lenora was saying. Papers rustled, a chair leg scraped. "Keep her visible and dependent until midnight. The scholarship face is useful, and useful girls do not ask about ownership." The solicitor answered too quietly for Ruby to catch every word, but she heard enough. Proxy paperwork, witness signatures, timing. Her fingers went numb around the ledger key still tucked in her sleeve. She did not move closer. She did not breathe deeply. She stood in the service corridor with kitchen steam at her back and ballroom music at her front and counted 4 steady beats, then 4 again, while Lenora discussed her life as if balancing accounts at quarter end. She remained where she was until the blood returned to her fingertips, then lifted her hand and knocked once upon the half-closed door. Lenora called for entry without impatience. Ruby stepped into the receiving office with the same composure she had practiced on the dais, ledger request ready on her tongue, pulse controlled by count rather than comfort. "Mr." Halden stood near the hearth with a sheaf of documents tied in green ribbon, his solicitor's case open on the side table. Lenora sat at the writing desk, spectacles low on her nose, one pen held above a page already marked with notations in 2 different inks. Neither expression changed at Ruby's entrance, though Holden shifted the packet in his hand a fraction too quickly. "The arrivals ledger, Mrs. Pike," Ruby said. Lenora looked at the clock, then at Ruby's shoulder pin, as if measuring whether this interruption had diminished the room's efficiency. "You were absent longer than instructed." The counting room required correction, and the receiving key had been moved. Lenora's gaze stayed on her face for one careful second. "You are to report delays through the corridor steward, not improvise routes." "Yes, Mrs. Pike." Holden cleared his throat. "Miss Brooks, good evening." She inclined her head. "Mr. Halden." Lenora opened the right desk drawer, withdrew the black leather ledger, and set it on the blotter without offering it yet. "The press photographer from the Gazette will request a statement between the second and third dance. Keep to approved phrasing. We do not need spontaneity." Ruby took the ledger when Lenora finally released it. On the desk, half covered by Holden's sleeve, she caught one line in thick legal hand before the paper shifted. Educational waiver. Beneficiary R. Brooks. The ribbon closed over the rest. She did not let her eyes return to it. "As you direct," she said. Lenora dismissed her with a nod, already turned toward her solicitor. Ruby crossed back into the corridor, closed the door softly, and walked towards the ballroom with the ledger against her ribs, as though warmth could be transferred by pressure alone. The music had swelled by the time she resumed her place near the dais steps. Guests moved in polished currents beneath the chandeliers, every gesture elegant and transactional. Lenora intercepted the ledger, checked 2 names, and moved away to greet a late baroness whose pearls had arrived before she did. Ruby was repositioned from the center of the platform to its left edge, where committee wives could be photographed with her profile in the background and the foundation crest above their shoulders. She took the mark assigned. Her hem caught on a splintered edge of temporary staging, pulling one inside stitch loose. She bent to correct it and heard the nearest committee woman murmur, with the bored cruelty of someone discussing table linen. "Even gratitude frays when it is second-hand." Another voice answered, low and amused. "Pins, then. Pins can make anything presentable." Ruby straightened. Her fingers went to the seam and found only the one bent fastener she had used in haste. She could not leave the platform without permission, and the tear would widen if she shifted weight during the next presentation. A candelabrum beside the donor arch had gone askew. A porter stepped from the service line carrying a small tool roll and a cloth. Elias Gray. He adjusted the base as if the floor itself required his full attention, then crossed behind the dais with professional invisibility, close enough for Ruby to smell clean metal and starch soap. Without looking directly at her, he set a folded paper packet on the marble ledge beside her gloved hand and continued on, pausing only to tighten the final candle cup. The packet contained 6 new dress pins, straight and bright. Ruby did not move for 3 breaths. Then she lifted one pin, anchored the torn seam from the inside, and restored the line of her gown before the next camera flash flared. When she raised her gaze, Elias stood near the service door with an empty tray angled against his hip. Posture neutral, eyes on her only long enough to confirm the repair had held. Recognition passed between them. No smile, no gratitude performance, no shared secret declared aloud. A simple accounting. Need observed, need answered. She returned the remaining pins to the folded packet and slid it into her glove cuff. The third dance began. The Gazette photographer called for her by surname. She delivered Lenora's approved statement without deviation, each sentence polished and false in equal measure. The foundation had changed her prospects. Discipline and support opened doors. She hoped one day to serve as others had served her. The photographer thanked her, already turning to capture the auction dais. Ruby watched him go and felt the paper packet against her wrist, a small weight that steadied more than the speech had done. Near 11, while pledges were read in increasing sums and applause rose on command, Elias passed along the wall line carrying a replacement lamp chimney. The scholarship pin on Ruby's shoulder had tilted under repeated movement. He did not stop. As he drew level, he spoke as though addressing the fixture. "Your clasp has turned." Ruby touched the pin and corrected it before Lenora could signal from across the room. "Noted." His mouth shifted at one corner, almost imperceptibly. "You are efficient, Miss Brooks." "So, I am told." He moved on. Nothing in the room changed. Yet something in her did, slight as a stitch drawn tight and holding. By the second morning after the gala, the house had entered its post-event machinery, that brisk administrative season when gratitude letters were drafted, pledges reconciled, and reputations tallied against receipts. Ruby attended the charity briefing on the church steps with a stack of intake cards and a tray of fountain pens, standing just below the rector's bronze rail, while committee members discussed winter coal allocations in voices trained never to sound like argument. St. James's Stone held night chill even in sun. The square smelled of wet leaves and horse leather. Across the steps, porters unloaded parcels of blankets and ledger crates from a hired cart. Elias was among them, coat buttoned high, left leg still guarded but stronger than on gala night. He lifted 2 crates at once, then set one aside when a younger boy reached for the heavier load. The gesture was efficient, not theatrical. The boy did not thank him, only blinked and obeyed the redirect. A woman from the East District approached Ruby with a ration docket and a shaking hand. "They say this is not mine, miss. I have had this mark since Michaelmas." The docket carried a committee signature that looked correct at first glance and wrong on second. The loop on the capital R closed too tightly, the downstroke uncertain. Ruby drew a clean form toward her, intending to rewrite quietly, but Elias had stepped near enough to set down a parcel at her feet. His eyes flicked once over the disputed docket. "That hand was copied from last quarter's register," he said, voice low, matter of fact. "The ink is newer than the paper." The district clerk bristled. "You are staff. This desk is not your concern." Elias straightened. Fraud is everyone's concern when blankets are rationed. The clerk opened his mouth, then shut it. Ruby did not look at Elias. She drew a line through the false mark, issued a corrected docket, and stamped it with the rector's seal. "The allocation stands," she said to the woman. "Present this at the East Depot before noon." The woman pressed the card to her chest and left with a whispered blessing. Ruby capped the ink bottle and kept her gaze on the forms. "You read signatures quickly, Mr. Gray." "I read patterns." "That is not a porter's training." "No," he said. "It is a habit." He lifted the next crate and moved down the steps before she could frame another question she had no right to ask. 3 days passed before she saw him again in the conservatory corridor, where donor portraits watched from gilded frames and every footfall echoed under glass. Ruby carried a portfolio of acknowledgement drafts to Lenora's secretary, who had developed a headache and sent for copies in Ruby's hand because it was neater than her own. At the bend near the citrus tubs, a viscount in plum waistcoat held court over 2 trustees and misquoted a Latin motto from the crest above the arch, turning a phrase about stewardship into one about spectacle. The trustees laughed as if the error were wit. Elias stood on a short ladder nearby, replacing a cracked pane latch. He descended when the viscount demanded that someone with schooling confirm the translation for amusement. Ruby kept walking. She was not addressed. Elias wiped his hands on a cloth and said, with perfect neutrality, "The dative requires care, my lord. The motto reads, 'For those entrusted to us,' not 'for those displayed by us.'" Silence followed, brief and precise. The viscount's face coloured. One trustee coughed into his glove. Ruby did not turn her head, but she felt the air tighten around the sentence and then release as conversation stumbled onward in safer directions. When she reached the secretary's desk, her hands were steady. She set down the portfolio and realized she was smiling, not from triumph, but from the dry, quiet elegance of the correction. Later, returning through the same corridor, she found the latch repaired and the ladder gone. On the sill lay a single brass screw she recognized from maintenance stores. It had been replaced with a stronger piece from private stock, the kind of detail few would notice, the kind he seemed to notice first. By the second week of October, repeated crossings had become their own grammar. He appeared where work thinned into disorder, at the loading arch when invoices arrived out of sequence, at the school annex door when firewood rations were short by 1 bundle, at the edge of the ballroom gallery during committee walkthroughs where nothing should have required a porter, and yet something always did. He did not seek conversation. He offered observations in short lines and left before they could be turned into intimacy. In the counting room, where pledge cards were sorted by district and donor class under the supervision of men who believed classification itself conferred authority, Ruby worked late to reconcile totals against bank drafts. Two stewards argued over 4 high-value cards that carried proper seals and mismatched handwriting. One wanted them entered, the other wanted them held. Their dispute had reached the loud phase when Ilias entered with a satchel of courier receipts for signature. He set the satchel down, glanced at the disputed stack, and spoke without raising his voice. Separate those by ink batch. The signatures are traced from the same sample. Compare pressure marks under sidelight. One steward scoffed. And since when do porters conduct audits? Elias met his gaze. Since tonight, if you prefer not to explain a false pledge to Mrs. Pike in front of trustees. The steward reached for the lamp without another word. The second steward followed his lead immediately, turning the cards to catch oblique light across the strokes. The forgeries surfaced within minutes. Identical hesitation at the same letter. Identical lift before the final line. Ruby noted the findings in the margin, sealed the suspect bundle and entered the valid sum. No one asked Elias to stay. No one thanked him. He had already picked up his satchel. At the door, he paused. "Miss Brooks," she looked up. "If you continue at this pace, you will miss supper." "That implies there is supper left." A real smile, brief and transformative, crossed his face and was gone. "I set aside a tray in the side pantry, top shelf behind the account books." He left before she could answer. Ruby finished the ledger entry, sanded the ink, and closed the register. In the side pantry she found bread, broth, and 2 pears wrapped in a clean cloth, arranged with practical care and no note. She ate standing by the narrow window, watching courtyard lamps tremble in the wind. Her mind returned to the counting room, the way 2 stewards had obeyed him before hierarchy could object, the way he had named pressure marks as if trained at a bank, the way command sat on him without display. None of it fit the roster line pinned in the kitchen hall. Temporary porter, Elias Gray, hired by week. She rinsed the bowl, folded the cloth, and returned both exactly where she had found them. Then she went back to her room above the laundry, removed the packet of dress pins from her glove cuff, and placed it in the top drawer beside Theo's letters and her tuition receipts. She did not ask what Elias Gray truly was. She had learned the cost of questions asked in the wrong room. For now, she chose the discipline that had kept her standing. Observe. Remember. Act when action mattered. In the morning, she would take the church steps again, and if he was there, she would nod as one worker to another, as if that narrow, careful warmth between them were nothing more than proper acknowledgement. At the church steps, the intake ledger balanced against her forearm. The stones still pressed cold through her glove, as parish women queued for coal chits and blanket marks under a sky the colour of pewter. She saw Elias near the supply cart, speaking to no one and noticing everything. When she lifted her head in greeting, he answered with the smallest inclination, formal as any acknowledgement between clerks who had met only in corridors. It should have been ordinary. It was not. The district clerk called for signatures. The queue tightened. Ink froze and had to be warmed between palms. Ruby worked through names, addresses, and allotment codes with practiced speed, pausing only when a widow from Chapel Lane reached the front and offered a ration card stamped with 2 conflicting seals. Ruby corrected the mark, issued a replacement, and sent her onward before argument could start. Across the rail, Elias shifted a crate from one shoulder to the other, favouring his left leg only when he believed no one watched. She noticed because she had begun to notice him in particulars, which was a habit she had not intended to form. As the briefing dissolved into committee assignments for the Foundation's autumn benefit luncheon, Lenora's secretary arrived with an envelope that bore Ruby's name in Lenora's upright hand. Ruby broke the wafer seal in the shadow of the vestry wall and read, without surprise, that she was required at Thornfield Hall by 2 o'clock for donor reception rehearsal and auxiliary representation duties as directed. At the bottom, added in a narrower line, sat the practical threat disguised as scheduling. Michaelmas stipend release pending satisfactory conduct. She folded the note once and slipped it into her cuff. At Thornfield Hall, the back courtyard seethed with preparations by mid-afternoon. Cooks shouted over copper pots, flower men carried crates of hothouse lilies, and stewards moved furniture with the tense precision of people terrified of scratching polished floors. Ruby changed from her outdoor cloak into the plain afternoon dress Lenora permitted for pre-event work and reported to the side hall, where she was assigned to copy place cards until supper bell. She had nearly finished the final table when a maid rushed in from the cloakroom, breathless and pale. "Mrs. Pike requests all staff in the West Passage at once," the maid said. "Lady Baron's sapphire clasp is missing." The words moved through the service corridors faster than smoke. Ruby set down her pen and followed the stream of aprons and coats towards the West Passage, where Lenora stood beneath a wall sconce with Mr. Holden at her shoulder and 2 trustees flanking the door to the private cloakroom. On the small side table lay an opened velvet case, empty except for a crescent indentation where the clasp had been secured. Lady Baron spoke first, gloved hand flat against her chest. "It was there when I arrived. I removed my mantle for pressing. 10 minutes later, gone." Lenora's tone remained clipped and calm. "No one leaves this passage until we complete a formal account." One by one, staff gave names and tasks. When it was the kitchen boy's turn, a narrow-shouldered child called Ben, who had recently been moved from scullery to corridor service, he stammered that he had carried a tray past the cloakroom but had not touched anything within. A steward produced from Ben's apron pocket a scrap of blue velvet ribbon with a silver thread edge. Lady Baron's maid pointed at once. "That trim matches my lady's mantle lining." The boy's face went colourless. "I found it on the floor near the coal scuttle, sir. I meant to hand it in." "After hiding it?" the steward asked. Ben shook his head so hard his cap slipped. No one met his eyes. In rooms like this, guilt attached first to the lowest wage and settled there unless dragged elsewhere. Ruby knew the ribbon proved little. She also knew proof often mattered less than convenience when a titled guest demanded restitution before doors opened. Lenora looked over the line of staff and paused on Ben long enough to confirm the decision already made. "Dismissal is immediate," Lenora said. "The constable will be notified after the reception." Ben made a small sound and bit it back. Ruby felt her hand close around the place card stylus still in her sleeve, the metal edge pressing into skin. She pictured the scullery ledger with his name crossed out, the black mark that would follow him to every kitchen in the district. Theo at the chemist's counter waiting for medicine while she calculated what refusal would cost. She heard, as if from 2 rooms away, Lenora ask whether any person wished to amend their prior statement before formal notation. Ruby stepped forward. "The ribbon is mine," she said. The passage turned still. Lenora did not frown. That would have implied feeling. "Explain." "I used a similar trim to mend a cuff this morning in the side pantry," Ruby said evenly. "I must have dropped the offcut while crossing this corridor." Lady Baron stared. "You are claiming responsibility for theft?" "I am claiming responsibility for the ribbon." "A distinction without value," one trustee muttered. Lenora's eyes held Ruby's for a measured beat. "Then you entered the cloakroom during restricted preparation and handled donor property." "Yes." It was a lie built from half-truth and timing. She had entered the cloakroom earlier to deliver corrected seating cards. She had touched no mantle and seen no clasp. But Lenora needed someone she could discipline without involving police before patrons arrived. Ruby had just offered herself. Mr. Holden adjusted his spectacles. "Mrs. Pike, if Miss Brooks admits breach of protocol, we may resolve this internally." Lenora inclined her head. "So noted. Miss Brooks is removed from tonight's donor address, stipend augmentation rescinded for this cycle, and all press access suspended pending review. She will perform back-of-house duties only." Lady Barron's maid recovered her voice. "And the clasp?" "We will reimburse from contingency," Lenora said. "Our concern now is operational continuity." Ben swayed where he stood, then straightened as if someone had pulled a string through his spine. He did not look at Ruby. He knew better. Gratitude could expose as easily as accusation. "As you direct," Ruby said. Lenora turned to the steward. "Return the boy to kitchens under watch. Miss Brooks to records annex after service." Then, to Ruby alone, quiet enough that only Holden might hear. "You choose disorder at expensive moments." Ruby kept her gaze level. "The reception will proceed." "It had better." The line broke. Staff dispersed in a hush that held more fear than relief. Ruby stepped aside to let a footman pass with fresh candle branches, and only then realized her palm was bleeding in a thin line where the stylus had bitten. She wrapped her glove tighter and walked toward the service stair before anyone could assign her an expression she did not feel. By the time lamps were lit in the North Gallery, she had been moved 3 times, from cloak check to inventory table, from inventory to plate count, from plate count to records annex, where she copied donation acknowledgements while music from the reception filtered faintly through stone. She was no longer on display. That was the price Lenora intended her to feel. She copied anyway, each letter exact, each donor title correct, each total verified against the provisional ledger. Loss did not excuse imprecision. An hour into that work, the annex door opened without knock. Elias entered carrying a stack of signed wine invoices and set them on the desk opposite her. "They need witness initials," he said. Ruby blotted the line she had just finished and reached for the top sheet. "Leave them." He did not leave. In the lantern light, his face was unreadable, but she saw the tension in his jaw, the way he held still when withholding speech. "You gave a false statement," he said at last. "There was no trim on your cuff." Ruby aligned the invoices by edge. "You inspect cuffs now." "I inspect what does not fit." She capped the ink bottle. "Then you know the boy would not survive a theft charge." He watched her for a long moment. "You could retract before the final register closes." She met his gaze. Dark eyes, direct, waiting without pressure and without rescue. "The child keeps work," she said. The words settled between them like a seal impressed in wax. For the first time since she had met him, something shifted openly in his posture. Not surprise, not admiration performed for effect, but commitment. A line crossed, quietly and without ceremony. He inclined his head once. "Understood." When he turned to go, she spoke before caution could stop her. "Did you see who took it?" He paused at the door. "No." A breath. "Did someone?" "Yes." She set the pen down very carefully. "Will they speak?" "Not while speaking cost them rent." Then he was gone, leaving the invoices and the soft draft from the corridor. Ruby signed where required, sanded the wet marks, and sent the packet to accounts by messenger tube. She did not ask who had stolen the clasp. She did not need the name to understand the structure. Theft had occurred. Blame had been allocated where consequences were cheapest. As the night deepened, The Gala auction swelled with greater fanfare than before, as if spectacle itself could erase administrative bruises. Ruby stood in a side antechamber off the East Gallery, waiting to be called for a revised appearance that no longer included speech, only presence near the trustees' table during pledge announcements. Her cream gown had been altered again, this time pinned tighter across the ribs. The scholarship emblem sat at her shoulder like a commandment. Through the half-open doors, she could hear applause rise and fall in measured waves as lots were presented and sums were called. She had learned to track Lenora's mood by cadence alone. Tonight the cadence was brisk and clipped, efficient enough to cut. A footman hurried past with sealed envelopes for the solicitor's room. Ruby stepped aside, then recognized Mr. Holden's voice from the adjoining antechamber, low but distinct through the partly closed panel. She should have moved on. Instead, she stilled, one hand resting against the gilt mirror frame to steady herself, as Lenora answered him. By dawn, she signs marital proxy and educational waiver, Lenora said, each word placed like a paperweight. Sentiment is expensive. Compliance is efficient. Holden murmured something about witness timing. Prepare 2 copies, Lenora replied. If Miss Brooks hesitates, remind her the scholarship terms permit reassignment of housing and medicine disbursement at trustee discretion. She prefers responsibility to risk. Use that. Ruby's fingertips went numb first. Then her jaw locked so hard she tasted iron where she had bitten the inside of her cheek without noticing. The mirror in front of her reflected a composed woman in pale silk, chin level, eyes clear. Her body told a different truth, pulse hammering at the throat, breath shortening, cold running down her back, despite the heat from nearby sconces. She counted silently against the wave, 4 in, 4 held, 4 out, because counting was still something no one could seize. Inside the room, Holden asked, "And the ownership query she raised after the luncheon discrepancy?" Lenora gave a soft exhale that might have been amusement. Useful girls do not own institutions, Mr. Holden. They personify them. A chair scraped, papers shifted. Ruby withdrew her hand from the mirror frame and found a faint crescent in the skin where a ring edge had pressed too long. She stepped back from the door before either voice could move closer, crossed the antechamber with measured pace, and paused in the shadow beside a marble pedestal until sensation returned to her fingers. When the usher came to summon her to the gallery, she was already upright, gloves smoothed, expression neutral. She took her place where directed beneath the chandeliers and watched Lenora greet trustees with untroubled grace. No one in that bright room could see the line that had just been drawn. No one, perhaps, except the man standing near the service arch with an empty tray and watchful eyes. Ruby did not look at him again. She stood through the next round of applause and felt something hard and clean settle beneath the ache, not louder than fear, stronger than it. Ruby kept her gaze on the auctioneer's platform while the room applauded a string of ivory miniatures, and she listened to the numbers climb as if they belonged to another language. Lenora moved through the front row with her usual clipped grace, accepting congratulations that sounded like assessments. At the service arch, Elias stood with an empty tray balanced at his hip, expression unreadable, eyes sweeping the room in patient intervals. Ruby did not signal him. She did not signal anyone. She waited until the applause broke against the marble and scattered into conversation, then stepped off her mark without permission and crossed behind the fern screen toward the side passage. A steward reached after her with a whisper meant to be polite and binding. "Miss Brooks, you are required in the East Gallery for the next pledge photograph." She did not stop. "Then the gallery may wait." In the corridor beyond the music, her breath came short against the pinned bodice. She walked faster, past the conservatory glass where candlelight doubled itself in dark panes, past the receiving office where Lenora and Holden had measured her future in clerical verbs, up the back stair she had been assigned for years. The house narrowed as she climbed, broad public halls contracting into painted service walls, polished marble giving way to worn runners that caught at her hem. Her room above the laundry smelled of steam, soap, and old paper. The single candle by the washstand had burned low enough to gutter. She closed the door, slid the bolt, and stood still until her hands stopped shaking. Then she moved. The carpet bag from beneath the bed. 2 dresses folded tight. 1 wool, 1 dark blue with a hem she could mend by morning. Theo's letters tied with string. The grammar book with dates in the back margin. Tuition receipts. 3 coins in a cracked porcelain dish. The packet of dress pins Elias had set beside her glove. She hesitated over the scholarship badge at her shoulder, fingers hovering above the metal as if it might burn. Lenora's voice seemed to live inside it, visible, dependent, useful. Ruby unfastened the clasp and set it on the washstand beside the spent matchbox. The pale mark it left on the silk looked like a healed wound. From the hallway came the laundry bell and the muffled rush of feet below. No one knocked. No one came to ask why she was no longer where she had been placed. At the bottom drawer of the narrow chest, she paused, then drew out the sealed envelope she had carried for years, without opening because she had never possessed the right combination of courage and occasion. Her mother's codicil lay inside, thick paper and dark wax, the Brooks crest pressed deep enough to catch light. She had been instructed to present it only if governance of the foundation was contested. At 19, she had thought contest meant formal disagreement in daylight rooms. At 25, standing in a servant's chamber while auction music shook plaster from the ceiling, she understood contest could wear the face of administrative routine. A quick knock sounded once, then again. Ruby lifted the bag and crossed to the door with the codicil tucked under her arm. Elias stood in the narrow corridor, no tray now, only the porter's coat and the alert stillness she had come to recognize, before trouble. "You left your position," he said. "Yes." "They will lock the trustees' chamber in 12 minutes. "Then I have 12 minutes. His eyes dropped to the carpet bag, then to the absent pin at her shoulder, and returned to her face. "Where are you going if this fails?" she answered without thinking. "Out." "Out where?" She adjusted the bag strap. "Somewhere Theo can breathe." A brief silence. The laundry pipes hissed behind them. Downstairs, applause rose again, brighter, oblivious. Elias stepped aside from the doorway. "The grand staircase is unguarded during lot transitions," he said. "Service routes are being watched." "Why tell me?" "Because you are done asking for permission." She studied him, searching for mockery and finding none. "Are you coming?" A small pause, almost a breath withheld. "I will be where I am required." It was not an answer. It was enough. Ruby extinguished the candle with her fingers, opened the door fully, and walked past him into the passage with her bag in one hand and the codicil in the other. She descended not by the cramped back stair assigned to staff, but by the central corridor that opened onto the house's main spine, where gilt mirrors rose from floor to cornice and portraits of benefactors watched with permanent composure. A pair of guests entering late stepped aside, startled by the sight of the scholarship girl striding through the wrong part of the house, carrying luggage as if she owned her direction. One whispered, "Unseemly." Ruby did not turn. By the time she reached the upper landing, 2 committee women had noticed and fallen into uneasy pursuit, their slippers quick on stone, their voices lowered to urgency. "Miss Brooks, return at once." "Mrs. Pike has not dismissed you." "Think what this will do to your standing." Ruby continued toward the grand staircase, hand gliding once along the carved banister polished by generations who had never been told to use the side door. At the top step, she stopped and faced them. Both women looked at the bag, then at the missing scholarship pin, then at her face, as though it had acquired an unfamiliar architecture. "Where are you going?" one demanded. Ruby gave her 4 words. "To the trustees' chamber." The women looked at each other, calculating whether to physically restrain a woman in formal silk before 200 donors. Neither chose that risk. Ruby turned and descended. The ballroom opened below in a blaze of crystal and brass. The auctioneer was introducing the Midnight Restoration Pledge. Lenora stood near the front row with Holden at her shoulder, both angled towards the platform, both composed. The trustees' chamber doors at the far end were half closed, guarded by an usher who knew Ruby only as the evening's exhibit. He stepped into her path as she approached across the edge of the dance floor. "Miss Brooks, this room is restricted." She set the carpet bag at her feet and held up the sealed codicil. "Then restrict me after reading this." He hesitated, eyes flicking toward Lenora for instruction. Lenora had turned now. Their gazes met across 12 yards of polished marble and moving silk. For 1 second, Lenora's face remained professionally blank. Then the blankness sharpened. "Miss Brooks," Lenora called, tone carrying over the orchestra without raising volume. "You are out of place." Ruby's voice did not rise. It carried anyway. "I am exactly where your solicitor said I should never stand." A hush rippled nearest them, not yet silence, but attention. The auctioneer faltered, glanced to the committee, and set down his gavel. Halden moved first, crossing toward Ruby with palms open, conciliatory. "If there is a misunderstanding," he said, "we can settle it privately." "No." "Miss Brooks, this is not procedure." She held the codicil out toward him, but did not release it. "Procedure requires recording instruments submitted by named beneficiaries. Record this." Lenora reached them, smile fixed for surrounding patrons. "You are distressed. Hand me the envelope." Ruby looked at her guardian and felt the old fear lift like a dropped weight, replaced by something cleaner than courage and less dramatic than fury. Not collapse, not compliance. A line, held. "Not yours," she said. Lenora's smile thinned. "Your education, your housing, your brother's medicine all depend on this institution functioning. You are jeopardizing your own family for spectacle." Ruby's fingers tightened on the wax seal. "You have mistaken dependence for consent." The nearest trustees, drawn by the break in choreography, converged at the chamber threshold. Sir Malcolm Vere, oldest among them and most invested in appearances, cleared his throat with ceremonial irritation. "What is this interruption?" Ruby turned to him. "Submission of testamentary codicil under contested governance. I request immediate reading before witnesses." Vere frowned. "At midnight?" "At once." Lenora spoke before he could answer. "The document is likely sentimental nonsense left by a grieving mother. We are in session with donors present. This can wait until morning." Ruby did not look at Lenora. "If it waits until morning, I will deliver it to Chancery before breakfast." That landed. Vere's jaw worked. Holden reached for the envelope again, slower now. "May I inspect the seal?" Ruby let him take it. He examined the crest, then the signature across the fold. His color changed by a degree. Not alarm. Recognition. "Sir Malcolm," he said carefully, "this appears authentic." Lenora's composure held, but her hand moved to her wrist, where no watch sat. "Authentic to what date?" Holden checked the outside line. "Executed the week before Mrs. Brooks's death." The chamber doors opened wider. Trustees filed in with reluctance masked as formality. Patrons along the edge of the ballroom leaned and whispered, smelling scandal where governance stood. Ruby lifted her bag and followed the trustees into the room without invitation. No one stopped her. The trustees' chamber was smaller than the ballroom and colder despite the coal fire, panelled in dark oak that absorbed sound and gave back only essentials. A long table ran its centre, inkwells placed at measured intervals, minutes ledger open beneath a lamp. Ruby set her bag beside the wall and remained standing at the far end, palms flat on the table edge to keep them steady. By the third hour past 11, every clock in Thornfield seemed to tick louder than usual. Holden broke the wax with a silver knife and unfolded the codicil. Papers whispered. Chairs creaked as men sat who preferred women to remain decorative and silent in adjacent rooms. Lenora took a place at the right flank, back straight, expression bored enough to signal confidence. Elias was nowhere visible. Holden read. The legal prose moved dense and deliberate through trusts, contingencies, naming conventions, succession timing. Ruby caught fragments she had heard in childhood when her father still reviewed accounts at the breakfast table. Fiduciary duty, preservative authority, anti-dissipation clause. Then the room shifted on one sentence and never recovered. Upon the natural majority of my daughter, Ruby Ann Brooks, full controlling interest in the Brooks Educational Foundation, shall vest without further petition. No one spoke. Holden continued, voice thinning slightly as he reached the appended witness schedule and contingent co-trustee provisions. Interim oversight to be jointly held by Executive Chair Lenora Pike and designated fiduciary Julian Ashford, operating under concealed review authority until vesting date. Sir Malcolm looked up first. Julian Ashford has not attended a single board sitting in 3 years. A chair scraped behind Ruby. She turned. Elias stood at the chamber door, portercoat unbuttoned at the throat, face composed. He stepped inside, removed the work gloves he had worn in corridors and service halls, and set them on the sideboard with unhurried precision. From his pocket, he drew a signet ring and placed it beside the gloves, crest facing up. Ashford. When he spoke, his tone was the same measured cadence she had heard over water glasses and forged signatures, only now it carried the authority everyone in the room had always obeyed without knowing why. I am Julian Ashford, court-appointed fiduciary and co-trustee under concealed mandate. He looked at Ruby, not at Lenora. Miss Brooks is not the scholarship recipient this foundation sustains. She is Ruby Brooks, sole controlling owner upon her 25th birthday, effective tonight. The sentence settled into the oak and ink and firelight, like a bell tone too clear to dispute. Ruby felt the table edge under her palms and for the first time all evening drew a full breath. Across the table, Lenora Pike folded her hands, as though the reading had confirmed an inconvenience rather than erased her authority. And for a brief second, Ruby saw the old strategy assembling itself again. Delay, diminish, defer, until morning. Lenora turned to Sir Malcolm with mild impatience. This is theatrics. Concealed mandates are not governance. Mr. Ashford's absence from proceedings nullifies practical oversight, and Miss Brooks has no experience sufficient to assume control. Julian did not raise his voice. The mandate required absence in name, not in function. I signed every quarterly audit under cipher and lodged duplicate records with Chancery. He slid a narrow leather folio onto the table. Holden opened it, scanned the first page, then the second, and sat back, as if the chair had changed beneath him. The cipher matches court registry, Holden said. So do the seals. Sir Malcolm looked from document to document, then to Ruby. Miss Brooks, do you assert your claim? Ruby felt the tremor in her right hand begin and end. "I do." Lenora shifted toward Holden. "Then read the amended conduct rider she signed this week. It binds her service and conduct for the year," Ruby answered before Holden could reach for another file. The contract was executed under custodial coercion, tied to medicine disbursement and housing access. "If you wish, I can identify the clause numbers from memory." Holden's mouth tightened by a degree. "I advise we do not litigate coercive instruments in this room." He closed the folio and turned to Sir Malcolm. "Immediate procedural motions are necessary." They came quickly after that, the way storms break after hours of pressure. Suspension of Lenora Pike, pending embezzlement review. Temporary removal of her signature authority on all disbursement ledgers. Transfer of executive control to Ruby Brooks, effective immediately under codicil vesting. Sir Malcolm spoke each motion in a dry, ceremonial cadence. Trustees who had watched Ruby from below a dais lifted their hands one by one and voted yes, not from moral awakening, but because the paperwork gave them no graceful alternative. When the final vote settled, Lenora rose. "You will regret haste," she said to the table, then to Ruby alone, flat and familiar. "Institutions are not run on feeling." Ruby met her gaze and kept her voice steady. "Then it is fortunate I brought ledgers." Julian stepped to the sideboard and lifted a sealed evidence envelope Ruby had not seen him set down. He placed it before Holden, who broke the wax. Inside lay Lady Baron's sapphire clasp, wrapped in inventory tissue, and beside it a contingency reimbursement form already drafted in Lenora's office hand. Holden stared. Where was this found? "In the false bottom drawer of Mrs. Pike's antechamber dispatch box," Julian said. "Logged 10 minutes ago in the presence of 2 witnesses." Lenora's composure altered for the first time. Not shattered, only narrowed. "You searched my office without permission." Julian's reply was almost gentle. "With owner authorization, retroactive by law, and immediate by necessity." Ruby turned to Sir Malcolm. "Record correction of disciplinary action against the kitchen boy, Ben Carter. He is cleared publicly before the next bell." Sir Malcolm hesitated. "That is a minor staffing matter." "Not to him," Ruby said. "Record it." He recorded it. Julian set down a second paper, this one a short witness statement signed with a shaky hand. "Laundry forewoman Mrs. Dobbins saw the ribbon planted in the boy's apron by Lady Baron's maid after cloakroom confusion. She withheld report because dismissal would have cost her family lodging. She speaks now under wage protection." That resolved the unfinished glance Elias had given in the annex and the sentence he had left incomplete. Someone had seen. Someone finally could afford to tell the truth. By the time the chamber doors reopened, midnight had tipped into the first minutes past, and the ballroom beyond had stalled in bright uncertainty, music suspended, glasses untouched in midair. Sir Malcolm moved to the threshold and announced, in the voice he used for endowment totals, that governance had transferred under valid testamentary instrument, that Mrs. Pike was suspended pending review, that all donor commitments remained secure. He did not mention shame. He did not need to. Society could do arithmetic when money changed hands. Ruby retrieved her carpetbag from the chamber wall and set it aside near the sideboard. She did not need to flee now. The scholarship pin still sat on her washstand upstairs. For a moment she pictured it there, small and dull in candle ash, and felt a quiet clarity settle. She would not wear it again. A footman appeared, uncertain whom to obey, holding a ring of keys that included the narrow brass one to Ruby's attic room and the cabinet keys for tuition and medicine ledgers. He looked between Lenora and Ruby until Lenora turned her face away. The footman extended the keys to Ruby with both hands. Miss, Madam Brooks, Ruby took them. Thank you, Thomas. Recognition moved through him like relief. On the ballroom floor, Ben Carter stood frozen near the service arch, tray tilted, waiting for punishment that no longer belonged to him. Ruby crossed to him through parted silk and black coats. Ben, she said. His eyes widened. Miss Brooks, I did not— I know. Your record is cleared. You return to work tomorrow if you still wish it. His mouth opened, then closed. He nodded once, hard and straightened to the height of his bones. The quartet resumed after a signal from the conductor, tentative at first, then sure. Ruby walked to the marble dais where she had stood as display and turned to face the room from its center. Chandeliers burned overhead. The foundation crest rose behind her shoulder. For the first time that night, no one told her where to place her hands. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, and the room quieted, not from affection, but from surprise. The Brooks Educational Foundation will honor every lawful pledge made tonight. It will also begin honoring the people who keep this house functioning. A murmur ran along the trustees' line. Ruby continued. Effective this quarter, scholarship renewals will be separated from personal service contracts. Staff wages in residential and kitchen wings will be raised to winter standard. False pledge reports filed this month will be reviewed by independent audit, beginning with the sealed bundle from the counting room. She saw one steward flinch at that, the same man who had scoffed at ink batch analysis, and then bow his head because pretense had become costly. Coal and blanket allocations at St. James's will proceed under corrected signatures only, Ruby said. If your name is on a docket, you will receive what was promised. She did not speak long. She did not thank the room for allowing her to exist inside it. When she finished, applause came in uneven waves, then steadied as people recognized a new center of gravity and chose proximity to power over loyalty to its former custodian. Lenora left before the final wave ended. She passed through the side corridor without looking back. Halden followed with the evidence folio under his arm, pausing only once to address Ruby at the base of the dais. Miss Brooks, I will file suspension notices before dawn and send certified copies to College Bursar and Chemist. Ruby answered, and to Chancery. He inclined his head, and to Chancery. An hour later, in Lenora's old office, now stripped of her presence but still smelling of lavender starch and coal, Ruby sat behind the walnut desk with Julian across from her, and the ledgers opened between them. She signed 3 directives in steady ink. Theo Brooks's medicine account prepaid for 6 months. St. Brigid's tuition disbursement released without conduct rider. Room assignments uncoupled from scholarship compliance clauses. She added one more line by hand. No beneficiary to be used in promotional display without written consent and stipend independent of performance. Julian watched her finish, then slid a small object across the desk. The scholarship pin. A maid found this in your room and brought it to the wrong office, he said. Ruby turned it once between finger and thumb and set it in the drawer, not discarded, not worn, not erased, filed as evidence of a life she had survived. Near the bottom of his document stack, she noticed the conservatory maintenance report, signed weeks ago under the initials J.A. The brass latch replacement was listed with a private stock notation, the same stronger screw she had once found on the sill and wondered about. Security audit, not accident. He had been repairing breaches while pretending to carry trays. By the time the east windows paled, the last trustee had gone. The votes had been entered in the minute book, and the codicil rested in the foundation's safe under Ruby's key instead of Lenora's. Outside, dawn thinned the night over the school grounds, turning frost on the railings to pale silver. Ruby stepped through the side door into the courtyard with her cloak pulled close. The air smelled of wet stone and coal smoke, easing into morning. Julian waited by the old U-path that led toward the annex classrooms, hat in hand, no title between them. "Miss Brooks," he said, then corrected himself with the smallest shift in tone. "Ruby," she stopped beside him. "Julian." He looked toward the school windows, then back to her. "I asked if I might walk the grounds with you at dawn. I am asking again now that you can refuse me freely." She studied his face in the early light. The same measured restraint, the same eyes that had seen her before. Recognition had a legal form. "Yes," she said. "Walk with me." They moved side by side along the gravel path in unhurried silence, past the annex where children would arrive within the hour, past the church rail where dockets would be stamped by steadier rules, past the marble facade that had once reduced her to emblem and now answered to her name. When her glove caught on a loose thread at the cuff, Julian offered the small packet of dress pins he had kept from gala night. 1 missing, 5 remaining. "For repairs," he said. Ruby took the packet, and this time she smiled first. "Efficient, Mr. Ashford." "Only if repeated." She laughed softly, and the sound carried cleanly in the morning air as they walked on together into the light.